The fluorescent lights of Eddie's diner buzzed with that particular frequency that made Sarah Chen's teeth ache, but after 3 years of opening shifts, she'd learned to tune it out along with everything else that made this place feel like purgatory with a breakfast menu. It was 5:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, and the pre-dawn darkness pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in from the cold, which was exactly what most of her customers were doing at this hour. Sarah moved through the familiar choreography of her opening routine with the kind of muscle memory that didn't require conscious thought anymore, flipping on the coffee makers, checking that the grill was heating up properly, making sure the ketchup bottles were filled and the salt shakers weren't clogged with the humidity that Seattle seemed to breathe into everything. She'd been doing this dance since she was 22, fresh out of community college with an associate's degree in graphic design that had proven to be worth slightly less than the paper it was printed on, at least in terms of actual job opportunities that paid enough to cover rent and her grandmother's medical bills. The door chimed and Sarah didn't even need to look up to know who it was because there was only one person in the entire city who showed up at Eddie's at exactly 5:35 every single morning like clockwork. Marcus shuffled in with that particular gait of someone whose feet hurt all the time, his layers of mismatched clothing giving him the appearance of a walking thrift store, his grey beard untrimmed and wild, his eyes roomy but somehow still sharp when they caught the light. He made his way to the same corner booth he always claimed, the one with the ripped vinyl seat that Eddie kept saying he'd fix but never did, and Sarah was already pouring his coffee before he'd even settled in because this was their routine, their unspoken agreement that had developed over the past 8 months. Most of the other waitresses wouldn't serve Marcus, not because he was rude or difficult, but because he was homeless, and Eddie had made it abundantly clear that he didn't want those people lingering in his establishment unless they were paying customers, which was a joke considering half the regular clientele looked like they'd crawled out of the same dumpsters. Marcus probably slept behind, but Sarah had never been good at following rules that seemed designed purely to make vulnerable people's lives harder, which was probably why she'd been fired from her last 2 jobs, and why her mother kept telling her she needed to learn when to keep her head down and her mouth shut. She set the coffee in front of Marcus with a smile that felt genuine, because it was, and he nodded at her with that same grateful expression he always wore, like hot coffee on a cold morning was some kind of miracle instead of just basic human decency. The thing was, Marcus never actually ordered anything beyond that first cup of coffee, which he'd nurse for hours while sitting quietly and bothering absolutely no one. But Sarah had developed a habit of accidentally making too much toast, or messing up an order of eggs and hash browns that just happened to end up in front of him, and Eddie hadn't noticed yet because Eddie rarely showed up before 9, and by then Marcus was usually gone, disappeared back into whatever corner of the city he called home. This particular morning felt different though, felt charged with something Sarah couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the approaching holidays making her more aware of the cold and the hunger, and the 1,000 small cruelties that the world inflicted on people like Marcus every single day. Or maybe it was the fact that she'd gotten another rejection email from a design firm last night and was starting to wonder if she'd still be pouring coffee and dodging her boss's wondering hands when she was 50. Marcus was shaking more than usual, his hands trembling as he wrapped them around the coffee cup, and Sarah noticed his lips had a faint blue tinge that made her stomach clench with worry because she'd seen enough rough sleeping regulars over the years to know what hypothermia's early stages looked like. Sarah made a decision in that moment that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet because none of us ever do when we're standing at those crossroads that seem insignificant until we're looking back at them from the other side. She walked back to the kitchen and started making Marcus a real breakfast, not the scraps and mistakes she usually passed off as accidents, but an actual meal with scrambled eggs and bacon and hash browns and wheat toast, the kind of breakfast that cost $12 on Eddie's overpriced menu and that she absolutely could not afford to give away for free, not when Eddie checked the inventory against the receipts every week and had already written her up twice for discrepancies. But Marcus was shaking and blue-lipped, and she couldn't just sit back and watch another human being suffer when she had the power to do something about it, even if that something was just a hot meal that would stick to his ribs for a few hours. She was plating the food when she heard the door chime again, and her stomach dropped because she recognized the heavy footsteps that followed, the particular way Eddie's boots hit the linoleum with that aggressive authority that men like him seemed to cultivate. He was early, which never happened, which meant the universe had decided that today was going to be the day everything went sideways. Sarah grabbed the plate and walked it out to Marcus before Eddie could emerge from the back office where he was presumably hanging up his coat and preparing to make everyone's morning worse just by existing in the space. Marcus looked up at the full plate with something like confusion crossing his weathered features, and Sarah just smiled and said, "On the house," even though nothing was ever on the house at Eddie's unless you were one of Eddie's drinking buddies or one of the women he was trying to sleep with. Marcus's eyes got shiny in that way that meant he was struggling not to cry, and he mouthed "thank you" without making a sound, and Sarah felt that particular ache in her chest that came from knowing she'd done the right thing, even if it was going to cost her. Eddie appeared from the back like a storm cloud in human form, his face already set in that expression of perpetual irritation that seemed to be his resting state, and Sarah watched his eyes track from her to Marcus to the full plate of food and back again. The air in the diner went tight and thin, and the other early morning customer, a trucker named Dale who came in every Tuesday, suddenly became very interested in his coffee cup. Eddie walked over to the booth where Marcus was sitting, and Sarah positioned herself between them without thinking about it, which was probably stupid, but she'd never been good at the kind of self-preservation that required watching bad things happen without intervening. Eddie looked at the plate, looked at Marcus, looked at Sarah, and his face did that thing where it got red starting from the neck and spreading upward like somebody was filling him with angry paint. He asked Sarah if she'd rung that meal up, and she said no, and he asked her if she was planning to pay for it herself, and she said she couldn't afford to, and he asked her if she thought she was running a charity, and she said no, but maybe they could all stand to be a little more charitable. That was apparently the wrong thing to say, which Sarah had suspected even as the words were leaving her mouth, but sometimes the truth demanded to be spoken even when speaking it was tactically inadvisable. Eddie told Marcus to get out, and Marcus started to stand up, leaving the food untouched, but Sarah told him to stay and eat, and Eddie's face went from red to purple. The next 5 minutes involved a lot of shouting, most of it from Eddie, some of it from Sarah, and none of it from Marcus, who sat there looking increasingly uncomfortable and guilty, like he was the one who'd caused this problem instead of just being a hungry human being who'd had the misfortune of existing in a society that treated poverty like a personal failing. Eddie fired her, right there in the middle of the morning rush that consisted of Dale and Marcus and a couple of construction workers who'd just walked in and were now backing slowly toward the door like they'd stumbled into a domestic dispute. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside Eddie's diner with a cardboard box containing her apron, a coffee mug with her name on it that someone had given her last Christmas, and 3 years of her life that now felt completely wasted, watching the rain start to fall in that fine Seattle mist that wasn't quite rain but would soak you through eventually. Her hands were shaking, not from cold but from adrenaline and anger, and the creeping fear that always came after you'd made a principled stand, and realized that principles didn't pay rent. Eddie had told her to get out and never come back, had actually pointed at the door like she was a dog being banished from the house, and she'd maintained her dignity right up until she hit the sidewalk and then promptly wanted to throw up. Marcus had tried to follow her out, but Eddie had blocked him, had told him that if he ever showed his face at the diner again, he'd call the cops, and Sarah had seen the defeat in Marcus's eyes as he'd shuffled past her without making eye contact, like he was ashamed of being the catalyst for her unemployment, even though none of this was his fault. The rain was picking up, transitioning from mist to actual drops, and Sarah didn't have an umbrella because she'd left it inside and there was no way she was going back in there to face Eddie's triumphant smirk. She started walking with no particular destination in mind, just moving because standing still felt impossible, her feet carrying her down the familiar streets of her neighborhood that suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming. She'd been fired before, she'd survived this, but that knowledge didn't make the immediate panic any less acute, didn't change the fact that she had $800 in her bank account and rent due in 2 weeks and a grandmother whose medication cost more per month than most people's car payments. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking if she could cover utilities this month, and Sarah wanted to throw the phone into the street, but instead she just typed back maybe and kept walking. She ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, one of those aggressively hip places with exposed brick and baristas who took their craft so seriously, you felt like you were bothering them by ordering, and she bought a latte she couldn't afford because she needed to sit somewhere warm and dry while she figured out what to do next. The barista was a kid with a man bun and gauge earrings who looked at her with the particular disdain that service workers reserved for other service workers who weren't maintaining the proper aesthetic, taking in her cheap diner uniform and her cardboard box of shame. Sarah found a table in the corner and pulled out her phone, opening her job search apps with the kind of dread usually reserved for dental procedures, scrolling through listings that all required experience she didn't have, or offered wages that wouldn't cover her grocery bill, let alone her rent. She updated her resume, adding Eddie's Diner to the list of previous employers and trying to figure out how to explain the gap that was going to start appearing when potential employers called for references, and Eddie told them she'd been fired for insubordination and theft. She wasn't sure feeding someone who was hungry qualified as theft, but she was pretty sure Eddie would frame it that way, and legally he probably had a case, which was another indictment of how fundamentally broken everything was. 2 hours passed like that, Sarah applying to jobs she probably wouldn't get, while her latte went cold and the morning crowd filtered in and out, everyone absorbed in their own dramas and completely unaware that her life was quietly falling apart in the corner. She was about to give up and head home when her phone rang with an unknown number, and she almost didn't answer it because unknown numbers were usually scams or bill collectors, but something made her swipe to accept. The voice on the other end was female, professional, with the kind of practiced warmth that came from years of corporate training, and she introduced herself as Jennifer, calling from the offices of Marcus Hartwell, and Sarah's first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake because she didn't know anyone named Marcus Hartwell. Jennifer explained that Mr. Hartwell would like to meet with her if she was available, and Sarah asked what this was regarding, and Jennifer said it was a private matter that Mr. Hartwell preferred to discuss in person, and could she come to the office this afternoon. Sarah looked down at her diner uniform and her cardboard box and thought about how surreal this day had already been, and figured she might as well lean into the weirdness, so she said yes, and Jennifer gave her an address in downtown Seattle that Sarah recognized as being in one of those glass and steel towers where the annual rent on office space probably exceeded her lifetime earnings. She went home first to change, swapping her uniform for the one professional outfit she owned, a black pantsuit she'd bought for job interviews that had seen better days but was at least clean and relatively unwrinkled. Her roommate was at work, which meant Sarah didn't have to explain why she was home at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday or why she looked like she'd been crying, which she definitely hadn't been doing in the shower for 20 minutes. The address led her to the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, where glass walls offered views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains and the kind of wealth that Sarah had only ever experienced as an observer from the outside. The lobby was all marble and reclaimed wood and abstract art that probably cost more than her car, and the receptionist was impeccably dressed in a way that made Sarah feel like she'd shown up to a black tie event in sweatpants. She gave her name, and the receptionist smiled and made a call and then asked her to wait, gesturing to a seating area with chairs that looked like they belonged in a modern art museum. Sarah sat on the edge of one of these chairs, afraid to lean back in case she somehow broke it, watching well-dressed people move through the space with the confidence of individuals who'd never been fired from a diner job. 15 minutes passed, then 20, and Sarah was starting to wonder if this was an elaborate prank when a door opened and a man emerged who Sarah recognized immediately, despite the expensive suit and the professional haircut, and the absence of multiple layers of thrift store clothing. Marcus from the diner was walking toward her, except he wasn't Marcus from the diner, he was Marcus Hartwell, and based on the way everyone in the office seemed to defer to him as he passed, he was someone important, someone powerful, someone who definitely should not have been eating charity breakfast in a rundown diner in a sketchy neighborhood. Sarah's brain was trying to process this information and failing spectacularly, stuck in a loop of confusion and disbelief, and Marcus was standing in front of her now, with that same gentle expression he'd always worn but somehow transformed by context into something entirely different. He asked if she'd come with him to his office, and Sarah stood up on autopilot and followed him down a hallway lined with photographs of construction projects and civic ceremonies, and Marcus shaking hands with people Sarah vaguely recognized from the news. His office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the entire city spread out below like a toy model, and Sarah stood there staring at it while Marcus closed the door behind them and asked her to please sit down. She sat, and he sat across from her, and there was a long moment of silence where Sarah tried to figure out what universe she'd accidentally slipped into, where homeless regulars turned out to be secretly wealthy and fired waitresses got called to fancy offices for mysterious meetings. Marcus started talking, and what he told Sarah made her previous confusion seem quaint by comparison, because apparently reality was much stranger than she'd imagined. He wasn't homeless, which she'd figured out by now, but he had been pretending to be homeless for the past year, as part of what he called a personal project, though that seemed like a deeply inadequate term for whatever he was describing. He explained that he'd built his construction company from nothing, starting as a day laborer 40 years ago, and working his way up through sheer determination and luck and timing, and he'd made more money than any person reasonably needed, and somewhere along the way he'd lost touch with what it meant to struggle, what it meant to be invisible, what it meant to need help and have nobody offer it. So he'd started spending time on the streets, dressed down and anonymous, observing how people treated him when they thought he had nothing, no power, and no money, and no potential benefit to offer them. Most people, he said with a sadness that seemed to age him, failed the test spectacularly, stepping over him or around him or pretending he didn't exist, and the few who did acknowledge him usually did so with contempt or pity, both of which felt dehumanizing in different ways. But Sarah had been different, had seen him as a person instead of a problem or a project, had fed him and talked to him and treated him with the kind of basic dignity that should have been unremarkable, but had become vanishingly rare. He'd been coming to Eddie's specifically because it was the kind of place where his presence as a homeless person would be unwelcome, wanted to see how the staff would react, and most of them had reacted exactly as he'd expected. But Sarah had surprised him every single day. He'd watched her give away food she couldn't afford to give away, had seen her get in trouble with Eddie multiple times for showing compassion to customers who couldn't pay, had observed her working double shifts to cover for co-workers and staying late to help the dishwasher, who had a bad back, and defending customers from Eddie's racism and misogyny. This morning had been a test, Marcus admitted, and he looked genuinely apologetic about it, said he'd come in shaking and blue-lipped on purpose, because he'd wanted to see if Sarah would risk her job to help him, and when she'd made him that breakfast knowing it would probably get her fired, he'd known she was exactly the kind of person he'd been looking for. Sarah's emotions were cycling through disbelief and anger and confusion so fast she felt dizzy, and she interrupted to ask what he meant by looking for, and Marcus smiled and said he wanted to offer her a job, not just any job, he clarified, but a position running a new foundation he was starting, one focused on supporting service workers and addressing homelessness and challenging the systems that kept people trapped in poverty, and he wanted someone who understood these issues from the inside, someone who'd actually lived them, rather than just studied them in business school. The salary he named made Sarah's vision blur slightly, because it was more than she'd ever imagined earning, more than she'd made in the last 3 years combined. Marcus was still talking about benefits and responsibilities, and the importance of bringing authentic perspective to philanthropic work. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to catch up with information that kept contradicting everything she'd thought she knew, and she heard herself asking why not someone with actual experience in non-profit work or social services or literally any relevant credential beyond a tendency to make bad financial decisions in service of moral principles. Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that reminded her of the quiet man in the corner booth who'd never asked for anything except coffee, and he said that credentials were easy to find but character was rare, and he'd spent a year watching her demonstrate the kind of character that couldn't be taught or faked. Sarah asked for time to think about it, which was probably ridiculous, given that she'd been unemployed for approximately 6 hours and was staring at a job offer that could solve every financial problem she'd ever had. But accepting felt too easy, felt like there had to be a catch somewhere, because life didn't work this way, didn't reward you for doing the right thing with fairy tale endings and 7-figure salary. Marcus said of course take all the time she needed, and gave her his card with his direct number, and told her to call when she'd made a decision, and then his assistant Jennifer appeared to escort Sarah back to the elevators, like she was visiting royalty instead of a fired waitress who was still processing the fact that the homeless man she'd been feeding was actually a billionaire who'd been conducting some kind of elaborate social experiment. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, 42 floors of Sarah staring at her reflection in the polished doors and trying to recognize the person staring back. She walked out into the Seattle afternoon, the rain having cleared to reveal that rare blue sky that made the city look like it belonged in a postcard, and she started walking with no destination in mind, just needing to move while her brain attempted to organize thoughts that kept slipping away like water through her fingers. Part of her was angry, felt manipulated by Marcus's test, even though she understood intellectually why he'd done it, felt like her genuine compassion had been turned into a performance she hadn't known she was giving. Another part was calculating, already mentally dividing the salary into rent and medical bills and student loans and maybe, possibly eventually savings, watching her chronic financial anxiety dissolve under the weight of actual security. But the loudest part, the part that kept pushing the other thoughts aside, was asking whether she'd actually earned this or whether she'd just gotten lucky, whether Marcus's offer was based on genuine respect for her abilities or just wealthy guilt manifested as charity. She found herself at Kerry Park, looking out over the skyline, where Marcus's office building rose above its neighbors like a glass monument to success, and she thought about all the decisions that had led her to this moment. Every choice to help someone when helping them cost her something. Every time she'd chosen compassion over pragmatism and ended up worse off for it. She'd been raised to believe that good things happen to good people, but experience had taught her that good things mostly happen to lucky people while good people just got exploited, and she'd made peace with that, had decided that she'd rather be good than lucky even if it meant staying poor. Except now she was being offered both, good and lucky intertwined in a way that felt too convenient to be real, and she didn't know how to accept it without feeling like she was somehow betraying every principle that had gotten her fired in the first place. Her phone rang, and it was her grandmother calling from the assisted living facility, and Sarah answered to hear the nurses saying there'd been an incident, nothing serious, but they needed to discuss adjusting her medications, which meant more costs that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Sarah hung up and looked at the business card Marcus had given her, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering that probably cost more per card than she'd made per hour at Eddie's, and she realized that her pride was a luxury she couldn't actually afford, that turning down the job to maintain some abstract sense of moral purity would be the ultimate privilege when she had people depending on her. Sometimes the right choice wasn't the hard choice, it was just the choice that let you survive long enough to make more choices later, and maybe that was okay, maybe accepting help when it was offered wasn't weakness but wisdom. Sarah called Marcus the next morning and accepted the position, and within 2 weeks she'd gone from pouring coffee at Eddie's diner to sitting in strategy meetings about housing policy and food security and systemic barriers to economic mobility, surrounded by people with degrees from schools she'd never dreamed of attending, discussing budgets that exceeded the GDP of small countries. The learning curve was vertical, practically inverted, and there were moments when Sarah felt completely out of her depth, drowning in acronyms and frameworks and theories that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. But Marcus had paired her with mentors, people who actually wanted her to succeed rather than watching her fail, and slowly the language started making sense, the strategies started clicking, and Sarah began to see how her years of struggling could be translated into insights that her colleagues with their pristine resumes couldn't access. She spent her days meeting with service workers and unhoused individuals and community organizers, listening to their stories and their needs and their ideas for solutions, and then she'd bring those perspectives back to the Foundation's leadership meetings where decisions were being made about where to direct millions of dollars in funding. The other executives learned quickly that Sarah wouldn't tolerate abstract discussions about poverty that treated poor people like theoretical constructs rather than actual humans, and her bluntness made some of them uncomfortable, but Marcus backed her every time, said that discomfort was the price of doing this work honestly. The Foundation bought Eddie's Diner 4 months into Sarah's tenure, not as revenge but as opportunity, converting it into a pay-what-you-can restaurant that employed people transitioning out of homelessness and served as a community hub for job training and resource connection. Eddie himself was offered a generous buyout and promptly disappeared to Florida, which everyone agreed was the best possible outcome for all involved. Sarah hired Dale the trucker to help manage the space because he'd quietly been paying for Marcus's coffee all those months when Eddie wasn't looking, and together they built something that felt like what Eddie's could have been if it hadn't been run by someone whose primary business model was exploitation and contempt. Marcus came in sometimes, Dressed normally now without the elaborate costume of his social experiment, he'd sit at the same corner booth and order coffee and pie, and Sarah would join him when she had time, and they'd talk about the work, about the challenges of trying to change systems that were designed to resist change, about the small victories that kept them going when the larger battles felt overwhelming. She learned that Marcus had grown up poor himself, had spent part of his childhood unhoused after his father died and his mother couldn't keep up with rent on a single income, and that experience had shaped everything about how he approached business and wealth and responsibility. He'd been testing Sarah, yes, but he'd also been testing himself, trying to remember what it felt like to be invisible and powerless, trying to maintain empathy in the face of extraordinary privilege. Some people called their relationship weird, this friendship between a billionaire and his employee, but it felt natural to both of them because it was built on something real, on mutual respect and shared values, and the knowledge that they'd both passed the same test in their different way. Sarah's grandmother's health stabilized with the better medical care that Sarah's new salary afforded, and she moved into a nicer facility where the nurses actually had time to talk to residents instead of just medicating them into submission. And when Sarah visited, her grandmother would squeeze her hand and say she'd always known Sarah's kindness would be rewarded eventually, even though they both knew that wasn't how the world usually worked. 2 years after that morning when Sarah had made Marcus breakfast and lost everything, she stood in the transformed space that used to be Eddie's diner and watched a woman named Patricia serve coffee to a customer who'd been sleeping rough last month, but now had an apartment and a job interview next week, and hope that hadn't been there before. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial projections, had launched programs in 6 cities and influenced policy at the state level, and demonstrated that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally correct, but economically sound, that investing in human potential paid dividends that no stock portfolio could match. Sarah had been promoted twice, was now Chief Impact Officer with a staff of 40 people, and a budget that still made her slightly dizzy when she thought about it too hard, but the work remained grounded in that same principle that had gotten her fired, the radical notion that everyone deserved to eat, and that feeding people shouldn't be controversial. She'd been interviewed by newspapers and podcasts, and even testified before Congress once, telling the story of losing her job for showing compassion, and how that moment had revealed both the cruelty of systems that punished kindness and the possibility of building something better. The story had gone viral, spawned think pieces and debates, and inspired other people in other cities to start their own initiatives, created a ripple effect that extended far beyond anything Sarah had imagined that morning when she'd simply seen someone who was cold and hungry and decided to do something about it. Marcus had stepped back from day-to-day operations of his construction company to focus on the foundation, said he was more interested in building communities than buildings now, and together they'd developed a model that other wealthy individuals were starting to adopt. This idea that philanthropy should be led by people with lived experience rather than imposed from above by those who'd never struggled. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better than what had been there before, and better was all you could really ask for when you were trying to change systems that had centuries of momentum behind them. Sarah still thought about that morning sometimes, about the choice she'd made without knowing it was a choice, about how easily she could have followed the path of least resistance and kept her head down and let Marcus go hungry rather than risking Eddie's wrath. She wondered about all the other moments like that, scattered through everyone's lives, where small decisions rippled outward into consequences nobody could predict. Dale had told her once that he'd almost not paid for Marcus's coffee that day, had almost minded his own business like everyone else, but something about Sarah's kindness had made him want to be kinder too. And maybe that was how change actually happened, not through grand gestures but through small acts that inspired other small acts until the whole landscape shifted. Patricia brought Sarah her cup of coffee, made exactly the way she liked it, because Patricia paid attention to details like that, had learned customer service working at the restaurant, and was now training to become a social worker herself, wanted to help other people the way she'd been helped. Sarah thanked her, and Patricia smiled and said, "It's on the house," and they both laughed because everything was on the house here, or rather nothing was because the whole system had been reimagined around abundance instead of scarcity. Marcus came in as the lunch rush was starting, and he caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward their usual booth, and they sat down together like they had countless times before, two people who'd found each other in the margins, and built something meaningful from the wreckage of a firing that had felt like the end, but had actually been a beginning. The work would continue, would expand and evolve and face new challenges and setbacks, but for now, in this moment, Sarah let herself feel something that had eluded her for most of her life, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and that maybe, just maybe, the universe occasionally rewarded people who chose compassion over convenience.